A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 20, Thessaly Wolf at the Gates. Rise of Alexander Part 2. You gathered children in the north, Pelopidas, while your own gates rusted. The plains belonged to the wolf once more. With the Theban presence entirely expelled from Thessaly, the garrisons broken, the local allies terrified back into submission, Alexander unleashed his full, unbridled wrath upon the region. Harvest of Iron. Freed from any southern restraint, the Tyrant did not attempt to build a cooperative democratic framework or heal the fractured city-states. Instead, true to the legacy of tyranny that had followed the vacuum left by Jason, Alexander reverted to raw, systematic terror. He turned his elite mercenaries loose upon the neighboring cities that had dared to entertain Theban sympathies. In the war room of Pherae, draped in dusty campaign maps and the stench of scorched oil, Alexander leaned over the broad oak table. His armored fingers traced a deep, gouging scratch across the parchment, right over the coordinates of the border towns. Around him stood his commanders, battle-hardened mercenaries, whose loyalties were bought with foreign silver rather than civic pride. They thought Pelopidas could build a cage around my throne, Alexander growled, his eyes fixed on the flickering torchlight reflecting off his iron greaves. They thought a few months of southern posturing would make these sheep forget who wields the whip in Thessaly. One of his captains, a scarred veteran from the northern ranges named Cretus, grunted in agreement. The border towns are restless, my lord. Larissa whispers of another embassy. Pharsalus still trades in secret letters with Boeotia. Alexander's jaw tightened, a dangerous, humorless smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Let them whisper, Alexander thought, a cold, surging rush of satisfaction warming his chest. Let them write their little letters and dream of democratic councils. Jason tried to reason with these merchants and landed gentry, and they rewarded him with an assassin's blade. He tried to build a coalition of equals. I will build an empire of survivors. Then do not send diplomats, Alexander commanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hiss. Send the mercenaries. Unleash every company across the valleys. Let every market square and civic hall run red enough to wash away their appetite for southern saviors. Within hours, the iron machinery of oppression rolled out from the gates of Pherae. The foreign mercenaries needed no second invitation. Moving through the countryside like a locust swarm, they descended upon the towns that had dared to treat with Thebes. To Alexander, governance was not an art of persuasion. It was a simple equation of terror and obedience. A cooperative framework is for kings who fear their own shadow, Alexander muttered to himself, pacing the length of the hall as distant reports of burning homesteads began to filter back to the citadel. Let them call me a butcher. Let them curse my name in their dark cellars. When a wolf rules the pack, the only law that matters is the snap of the jaws. The heavy oak door of the townhouse in Larissa shuddered under the force of a brutal, repeated kick, the shockwaves rattling the clay oil lamps hanging from the ceiling beams. Inside, old Archon sat frozen at his writing desk, his knuckles stark wide as his hand trembled so violently he could barely hold his bone stylus. Across the room, his wife clutched their youngest daughter so tightly against her chest that the child let out a stifled whimper. The mother bit her lower lip to silence her, pressing down so hard that a tiny bead of bright crimson blood trickled over her chin, though she was too paralyzed by terror to even wipe it away. We should have fled south when the couriers first rode for Thebes, Archon thought, his breath catching as another deafening crash shook the doorframe, sending splinters raining down onto the mosaic floor. We trusted Pelopidas. We believed a treaty signed in ink and backed by Boeotian steel could shield us from a monster. But the Thebans are caged behind their own stone walls in the Cadmea, and the wolf has returned to the fold to finish us. Open the door in the name of the Tagus. A harsh, guttural voice roared from the threshold, followed by the screech of metal prying against iron hinges. With a final, violent shriek of splintering timber, the door burst wide open, crashing backward against the plaster walls. A squad of foreign mercenaries poured into the quiet parlor, instantly fouling the air with the suffocating stench of rancid sweat, sour, unwatered wine, and greasy, unwashed leather. Their bronze breastplates were dented and smeared with the soot of burned suburbs, their eyes wild and bloodshot from days of pillage. Archon slowly pushed himself up from his chair, trying desperately to project a shred of civic dignity he no longer possessed. He straightened his tunic, lifting his chin as elders of Larissa had once done before kings. "I am an Archon of this city," he began, his voice cracking. Before he could finish, a mailed fist struck him across the face with the force of a falling stone. The heavy iron plate of the mercenary's glove caught him squarely on the jaw, sending him crashing violently into a stacked pile of parchment scrolls. "This is the democracy we whispered about in the shaded colonnades," Archon thought, tasting the bitter copper of his own blood as he spat a loosened tooth onto the cold stone floor. Through a haze of pain, he watched in helpless horror as two rough hands grabbed his weeping wife, dragging her away across the floor, while soldiers ransacked the cabinets. "This is what remains of our freedom, a boot on our necks, a burning city, and a knife at our throats." Farther south, in the once proud city of Pharsalus, the nightmare took on a more public, methodical form of slaughter. The central marketplace, usually bustling with merchants haggling over imported grains and ringing with lively civic debate, had been transformed into a macabre theater of state terror. Piles of rough-hewn timber and the shattered headless statues of past civic leaders littered the blood-stained cobblestones, reduced to silent witnesses of the city's humiliation. At the center of the square stood Alexander of Pherae, his arms crossed over his dented bronze breastplate, watching with cold, dead eyes as his guards hauled out the leading citizens, senators, and members of the aristocratic houses who had dared sign the petition for Theban liberation. Lysias, a respected magistrate of Pharsalus, stumbled forward, shoved roughly onto the wooden scaffold by a mercenary spear, but his hands were bound tightly behind his back with hemp rope, his once fine robes stained with the damp filth of the municipal dungeons. He looked out over the sea of his fellow citizens, men and women forced to witness the spectacle at sword point, their faces hollowed out by absolute despair. "Look at them," Lysias thought, his chest heaving as he scanned the terrified, silent faces of his neighbors standing frozen in the square. "They break their own altars, they watch us die in chains, just because they are too terrified to draw a breath. We traded our independence for a fleeting hope of salvation when we called for Thebes, and now the price of that single signature is being exacted in our blood." Alexander stepped closer to the base of the scaffold, the heavy steel of his greaves scraping against the wood. A cruel, humorless grin stretched across his lips as he looked up at the captive magistrate. "You called yourselves the voice of the plains, Lysias," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed, suffocating silence of the market square. "You begged southern monks and foreign generals to save you from my justice. Where is your Boeotian phalanx now? Let Pelopidas come and pull you from this wood." Lysias lifted his chin, staring down at the tyrant with a mixture of defiance and profound grief. "You can burn our statues, Alexander, and you can butcher every senator in Pharsalus," Lysias said, his voice ringing out steady despite the trembling in his limbs. "You rule a graveyard, not a state. A crown built on the throat of free citizens is nothing more than a hangman's noose." Alexander's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of dark, murderous irritation. He turned his back on the scaffold with a casual, dismissive flick of his hand. "Let them speak of freedom while the iron takes them," Alexander thought, his eyes narrowing as he signaled the executioner. "There is no room for debate where a wolf holds the leash. Let every city in Thessaly watch how Pharsalus pays for its defiance." With a dull, sickening thud, the heavy axe fell, sealing the fate of the city and broadcasting the tyrant's terrifying message across the plains. Lysias, a respected magistrate of Pharsalus, was shoved roughly onto the wooden scaffold. His hands were bound behind his back, his robes stained with the filth of the dungeons. He looked out over the silent, weeping crowd of citizens forced to witness the spectacle at sword point. "Look at them," Lysias thought, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of his neighbors standing frozen in the square. "They break their own altars, they murder their own blood, just to prove that terror is a more effective master than law. We traded our independence for a fleeting hope of salvation, and now the price is being paid in our sons and daughters." "You called yourselves the voice of the plains," Alexander called out, his voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the square like a razor. "You begged southern monks and foreign generals to save you from my justice. Let your precious Thebes come and pull you from this wood now." Alexander raised his hand, giving a sharp, casual flick of his wrist. Let the blood flow until every city learns its place, Alexander thought, a cruel, unchanging smirk touching his lips as the heavy executioner's axe rose into the harsh sunlight. There is no room for freedom where a wolf holds the leash. With a dull, sickening thud, the axe fell, and the screams of Pharsalus were swallowed whole by the roaring iron of the tyrant's reign. From the high, fortified ramparts of the Cadmea, where the Theban forces were now completely caged behind massive stone walls, under the tightening political siege, commanders stared out toward the northern horizon with grim disbelief. Alexander stood upon a captured hill overlooking the smoking ruins of a defiant Thessalian suburb, a dark, triumphant smirk cutting across his face as he watched his men put the torch to another rebellious quarter. Let them cower behind their sacred Boeotian walls, Alexander thought, his hand resting heavily on the pommel of his blood-stained sword as the cries of the subjugated city drifted up on the wind. Let Pelopidas nurse his hostages and chew on his bitter messages. Thebes thought they could chain the north with treaties and phalanxes. I have burned their illusions to ash, and every city from here to Olympus will learn that the plains bow only to the iron wool of Pherae. Cried to the south. The blood spilled in Larissa and Pharsalus soaked deep into the cobblestones, but the terror could not permanently silence the whispers of a broken aristocracy. In a hidden cellar beneath a crumbling olive press on the outskirts of Pharsalus, a small gathering of surviving nobles sat around a flickering clay oil lamp. The air was thick with the scent of stale wine, sweat, and impending doom. Among them sat old Archon, his bruised jaw wrapped in a linen cloth, and representatives of the hunted Aleuadae families who had managed to slip past Alexander's patrols. "We cannot survive another month under the iron heel of Pherae," whispered a younger nobleman, his voice cracking with panic as he clutched a crumpled sheet of papyrus. "Every granary has been stripped bare to pay his foreign mercenaries. Every night another family vanishes into his dungeons. If we stay silent, we are walking corpses." Archon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the rough wooden table. His hands still trembled from the memory of the soldiers breaking down his door, but his eyes burned with a desperate, unyielding fury. "We placed our faith in a half-measured rebellion once," Archon thought, a bitter knot twisting in his stomach. "We trusted Pelopidas to sweep the plains clean, but the Thebans marched back to their southern walls the moment the northern dust settled, leaving us to the mercy of a madman. Yet what choice remains? To fold our hands and wait for the executioner's axe's suicide. We appeal to Thebes once more," Archon said aloud, the words heavy and dangerous in the confined space. Not as petitioners asking for a favor, but as desperate men reminding the Boeotian League of their broken promise. "They hold our hostages. They claim to be the liberators of Greece. Let them prove it." A murmur of tense agreement rippled through the shadowed room. Quill pens scratched frantically across fresh parchment as a formal, impassioned dispatch was drafted, a desperate plea penned in secret, detailing the atrocities of the tyrant, the burning of the suburbs, and the methodical slaughter of the civic magistrates. Let the couriers ride south by night through the mountain goats' paths, Archon thought, watching the scribe seal the hot wax with a shaking thumb. Let the letter find its way past the border guards and into the hands of Pelopidas himself. If the great general of Thebes has any honor left, he must hear the cries rising from the ruins of Thessaly, before the wolf tears out our throat entirely. Assembly of the Seven Gates. The dust of the northern mountain trails was still caked thick upon his woolen cloak, when the secret courier was led through the massive bronze-reinforced gates of the Cadmea. Inside the cavernous, stone-vaulted hall of the Theban assembly, the air was heavy with the scent of burning laurel and the low, tense murmurs of the magistrates. Pelopidas sat among the council elders, his expression grave, his mind still weighing the fragile balance of the northern border that had unraveled the moment his back was turned. The courier, a young Thessalian whose eyes were hollowed out by days of sleepless flight, stepped into the center of the floor, dropping to one knee before the raised dais. He drew a crumpled, wax-sealed parchment from the lining of his tunic and held it out with trembling hands. From the surviving magistrates and noble houses of Thessaly, the courier gasped, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We bring no polite petitions, men of Thebes. We bring an accounting of blood." Pelopidas stood up, his heavy boots clanking against the marble as he descended the steps. He took the parchment, breaking the seal with a practiced heavy thumb, his eyes scanning the rapid panic script written by old Archon's own hand. "The tyrant has unleashed his mercenaries upon every town that trusted us," Pelopidas read, a dark, heavy frown carving deep lines into his weathered face. "Larissa bleeds in the night. Pharsalus is a slaughterhouse of public executions. The wolf rules the plains without restraint, and our people cry out to the only city that promised freedom." A restless stir rippled through the seated counselors. Several elder statesmen shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves about exhausted treasuries and the strain of garrisoning the Boeotian League. Pelopidas crushed the parchment slightly in his mailed fist, a cold wave of anger and professional pride washing over him. "We left the north too soon," Pelopidas thought, his jaw tightening as he stared down at the desperate plea. "We took our hostages and thought a treaty could bind a madman like Alexander. We caged ourselves behind these walls, believing the border was secure, while the tyrant burned our allies to ash. If we turn a deafening ear to this cry, the honor of Thebes is worth less than the ink on this page." He stepped forward, raising his hand until absolute silence fell over the assembly hall. "They appeal to our honor, and they speak the truth," Pelopidas declared, his voice ringing out with fierce, resonant authority. "We left Thessaly under the shadow of a treaty, and the tyrant has answered it with steel and fire. The north is drowning, and if we do not march to break the wolf's jaws once and for all, no city in Greece will ever trust the word of Thebes again." The late afternoon light, filtered through the high, narrow windows, cast long shadows across a large, unadorned room within the Theban military complex. It was a utilitarian space, dominated by a massive oak table scarred with the rings of countless wine cups and the faint impressions of compass points. Scrolls lay unfurled across its surface, depicting the winding rivers and treacherous passes of Thessaly. Epaminondas, a figure of quiet intensity, stood by the table, his finger tracing a line on one of the maps, his brow furrowed in thought. He wore a simple tunic, devoid of the military finery that adorned many of his peers, yet his presence commanded an undeniable authority. The heavy door creaked open, and Pelopidas strode in, his face etched with a familiar mix of weariness and restless energy. He threw a fresh scroll onto the table, its seal still unbroken. "Another one," Pelopidas grunted, running a hand through his short, grizzled hair. "From Larissa. Complaining, begging, demanding succor from Alexander of Pherae, as if we have naught else to do but police their endless squabbles." Epaminondas didn't look up immediately, his gaze still fixed on the map. "Did you expect otherwise, my friend? A viper, once scotched, rarely dies without a second strike. Alexander is a tyrant by nature. He will not be curbed by a mere demonstration of force, nor by negotiated treaties. He has no intention of honoring." Pelopidas pulled out a stool and sank onto it, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. "I know. However, our last expedition last year was resource-intensive. We showed him Thebes' resolve. We secured the League for Thessaly. Yet now the appeals are renewed, more urgent than before. He's seizing more land, extorting wealth, and interfering with trade routes crucial to our northern allies." "So the viper reveals its true fangs," Epaminondas murmured, finally looking at Pelopidas, his eyes holding a blend of weariness and unwavering determination. "What do the appeals specifically ask for?" Pelopidas unrolled the new scroll, though he already knew its contents. "They claim he has violated the terms of the previous settlement, that he's imposing his will on their assemblies, confiscating property, taking hostages of his own. They speak of his cavalry raiding far beyond his acknowledged borders. They accuse him of plotting against the common peace of Hellas." He paused, a muscle twitching in his jaw, and some whispered that he's even stirring trouble in Macedon, trying to exploit their current chaos. Epaminondas nodded slowly. "That aligns with my intelligence. A stable Thessaly is paramount for our northern strategy. It buffers us against the wild tribes and provides vital levies. If Alexander consolidates his power unchecked, he becomes a greater threat than even Sparta was in the south, for he is a tyrant bound by no honor." "So another intervention then?" Pelopidas asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. He knew the answer. Theban hegemony demanded it. Their reputation, their very policy of protecting allies, hinged on it. "It appears so," Epaminondas confirmed, a sigh escaping him. "But this time we must be more cautious. Alexander is a cunning adversary, and his desperation may make him more dangerous." He has learned from your previous visit. He moved to a different part of the map, tracing a more circuitous route. We must consider logistics, our lines of communication. The campaign in the Peloponnese still draws heavily on our manpower. I'm also needed to oversee the new fortifications in Boeotia and address the lingering Spartan threats. I'm currently engaged in other urgent Theban affairs. Perhaps we should wait, gather a larger, truly overwhelming force, and ensure our readiness is absolute before committing. I'm not available to lead this expedition with you, my friend. Pelopidas' eyes flashed, his impatience barely contained. He pushed himself up from the stool, his voice firm. Wait? Epaminondas, we cannot afford to wait. Every day we delay, Alexander's tyranny deepens its roots, and our allies suffer further. Our influence, painstakingly built, will erode. Thebes cannot appear hesitant, especially not now, after our bold move in Macedon. We've just brought order there, secured young Philip and the other princes. If we allow a tyrant to run rampant on our very doorstep, our newfound influence in the north will crumble. He gestured emphatically towards the map. I will take the available forces, the sacred band, and the cavalry. We have enough to make a decisive statement. The Thessalians are crying out for us. I will lead the army alone if need be. Epaminondas' brow furrowed, a deep concern clouding his eyes. I'm aware of our commitments, Pelopidas, and the urgency of the appeals. The perception of strength is as important as its reality. And the protection of our allies is a sacred duty. But to rush in without full preparation, without our combined strength. Alexander is not to be underestimated. His cruelty is matched only by his deviousness, and he has proven himself capable of treachery against even those who come in peace. This event will leave you alone with the army. Consider this, my friend. Your life is too valuable to Thebes to risk it on a hasty venture. Pelopidas, however, was already resolute. He shook his head, a grim determination settling on his face. Then, prudence we shall have in our approach, but the viper must be dealt with once and for all. I will lead the available army. The time for deliberation is past, the time for action is now. He looked at the map, his eyes narrowing, already planning the swift march. He was confident in his abilities and optimistic about Theban strength. The idea of treachery, of capture, was far from his mind. The challenges ahead were strategic, not personal. He walked towards the door, already envisioning the order he would restore. Epaminondas watched him go, then turned back to the map, his finger lingering on the region around Pherae. He knew the dangers. He was aware of the unpredictable nature of tyrants. And he knew the cost of every campaign, even the victorious ones. The shadow of fate, however, remained unseen. Later that evening, in Epaminondas' private quarters, a room furnished with only a simple cot, a writing table, and a few scrolls, Caphisidoros sat with him. The younger man, his face etched with concern, poured water from a plain pitcher for both of them, his movements gentle, almost solicitous. A heavy silence hung in the air, weighted by the impending departure of Pelopidas for Thessaly and the chilling premonition of danger that clung to Epaminondas. Caphisidoros' gaze lingered on Epaminondas' weary profile, a silent question in his eyes that went beyond mere professional duty, touching the very core of their shared lives. They push you too hard, General, Caphisidoros said, his voice soft, a note of deep personal worry woven into the words, as if each syllable carried the weight of his own heart. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then gently rested on Epaminondas' arm, a fleeting, comforting touch that spoke volumes of their unspoken bond. Even after all you have done for Thebes, they seek to undermine you, and now. Pelopidas is about to depart, by himself with a small number of companies, to face that viper alone. It must weigh on you terribly. I can feel the burden you carry. Epaminondas sighed, a profound, almost bone-deep weariness escaping him. He ran a hand over his brow, then briefly, almost instinctively, covered Caphisidoros' hand with his own, a gesture of shared burden, of solace found in quiet understanding. It is the nature of the polis, Caphisidoros, he murmured, his voice rough with fatigue. Ambition, envy, short-sightedness. They see the immediate cost, not the long-term gain. But the work in the Peloponnese is far from complete. The Arcadian League, while allied with us, is still finding its footing and is susceptible to internal divisions. And Sparta, though wounded, is a beast that heals slowly but surely. Maintaining that delicate balance, ensuring the loyalty of the newly freed populations, countering any resurgence from Sparta. It is a constant vigilance, a relentless demand. He gestured to a map unrolled on his table, covered with notes and diagrams, the lines of strategy mirroring the lines of worry on his face. I'm building a new political order, my beloved, not just winning battles. This requires constant attention to diplomacy, to the construction of fortifications in Messenia, to the subtle art of alliance management. My presence here, in Thebes, is essential for navigating these domestic challenges, for ensuring the Boeotian League remains unified and strong. He looked at Caphisodorus, a flicker of weariness in his eyes, but also a profound, unwavering trust, a reliance that went deeper than words. And now, with this new crisis in Thessaly, Alexander of Pherae is a viper, as Pelopidas rightly calls him. I could not be in two places at once, and the foundations we have laid in the south are too vital to leave unattended. Pelopidas, with his swiftness and courage, was the one to send north, even if it meant he went alone. My heart aches for the peril he faces, and for the choices we are forced to make. Caphisodorus, his young commander, and Eromenus, beloved and mentee, gently sat closer to Epaminondas, his Arists, older lover and mentor. He looked into Epaminondas's eyes, a silent plea for him to find peace. "Don't be too stressed out, my general," Caphisodorus murmured, his voice a balm. "You secured the bull, making a new order. Political maneuvering takes time. It's not going to change or be built overnight, unlike field battles. Come with me. We haven't spent much time together for some time." Epaminondas looked up at his young lover, a cynical smile playing on his lips, then met Caphisodorus's gentle, reassuring smile. As Caphisodorus leaned in and kissed him softly, Epaminondas felt the weight of all the worries in his mind begin to wash away. That simple, gentle kiss was a sanctuary, a moment of profound calm amidst the storm. That night was still young, and so too was their shared passion. To be continued in episode 21, Macedon or a House Divided. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesius Playlist. Volume 2, Laches, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.